Good evening. Tonight I'm going to have a look at this book by Daniel Shubin, New Rosicrucians of Early Soviet Russia, where he gives some fascinating details and transcripts of interviews with some of the occultists who sprang up around Russia following the Edict of Toleration of Religion, proclaimed there in 1905, which gave them 10 to 12 years to blossom into an incredible modern, for them, Rosicrucian movement, especially in St. Petersburg and Moscow, just before the Bolshevik Revolution, whereupon, having experienced a wonderful freedom and tolerance, they then became persecuted, hounded to death in some cases, sent to gulags, forced underground, forced to leave the country as refugees, and henceforth, begun to endure the horror that was the Red Terror during the Russian Civil War. So Daniel Shubin, he's looking at some of the most prominent of these orders, and some of the only information we have about them comes from the testimonies they gave to the secret police when they were arrested, which makes some of these testimonies really quite moving, especially given that a lot of the people were very young and idealistic, much as people come into mysticism and spiritual subjects now are often of a sensitive nature, religious, godly and good people. But what this also helps to do is give it a bit of background to some of the material we've been looking at from Miebs, Shmakov, and the occult orders that we touched upon when I was looking at the Dark Order, which targeted Valentin Tomberg, which, as I've pointed out to a couple of people, I've kind of revised my thinking on this. I was thinking quite speculatively when I made the video, which is fine, but as more information becomes available, it's good to keep updating, I think. So there's a section here called Beliefs and Rites, where he's giving a general overview on some of these secret societies, and it's quite a brief section, so I think this will be a good place for us to begin. He asks, with what did these Rosicrucian groups, occupy themselves all this time? Secret societies are called secret because their inner proceedings are hidden from the unconsecrated. It is possible to list the names of their members, places of assembly, results of activities, but that which is principal, thoughts, feelings, ideas, convictions, rites, is all hidden behind a curtain of secrecy. This especially pertains to societies that are connected with rituals of mysticism. Only its members and its documents can explain the matter. Only its members and documents can explain the inner workings of the orders, And here I am fortunate in this matter, but only in regard to the Orionists. As far as the orders of Emesh Redivivus and Lux Australis are concerned, nothing is available regarding their rites and little on their beliefs, except for their testimonies provided during interrogations. If you remember, Emesh Redivivus is the one that I particularly focused on when considering the groups which might have targeted Tomberg. Not that I thought the founders of that group were targeting him, because the founders of that group go back to Miebs, who's one of the, he was on the right side. But what I postulated is that they possessed a very high degree of occult knowledge, which was ripe for subversion, given that some of the occult orders and people who even said that they were Masons at that time switched, tried to work for the Bolsheviks. Maybe some of them had good intentions. They thought that they should, they supported the cause. They thought it was a good thing at the time, as so many people still do about communism. Or they just didn't want to fall foul of the authorities, so they weren't necessarily working with evil intention. But I think some of them might have been, at least insofar as they were willing to employ black magical means to achieve their goals. So anyway, he's saying this was a very secret order, the Emesh. Even though we do know about their 9-point plan for world domination. Not meaning that in a bad way either, but just, major goals, big goals. So anyway, we've only got the testimonies given during interrogation, so that's already a little bit suspect, but still, it's all we have to work with. And then he's saying that subsequent chapters of translations of Belustin, Shmakov and Dorogova provide us the beliefs of the Orionists, and in vast amounts and great detail. The Orionists, and specifically Belustin, in a practical manner, strove to expound and codify on paper all of what their lives consisted, for what they hoped, and how they were intending to assist Russia and all humanity. They left behind themselves an immense quantity of manuscripts where their beliefs, legends, proceedings, rites, carefully developed art and numeric symbolism, also necessary for their mystical rites, was preserved. Remnant information about this gathering was retained among the very youngest of the Neo-Rosicrucian Orionists, who was able to evade arrest, V.P. Monin. And if you'll recall, if you've been following this series, Belustin was the heir of Vladimir Shmakov. So when Vladimir Shmakov left Russia, he was rescued by the president of Czechoslovakia, who was a friend of his who'd previously been to Russia and helped by Shmakov. So when Shmakov needed assistance in escaping, and this Thomas was the man to do it, Shmakov left behind Belustin, the Moscow St Germain, in his place, and he became, the Rosicrucian leader there, especially given that Mebes by that time had been already sent to the Gulag. So Belustin really was the man, and I would say, even the father of Russian cosmism in some ways, from a spiritual sense at least. Scrupulously, these manuscripts describe the symbols created by the Moscow Neo-Rosicrucians for their various rituals, the various combinations of colours, and the mystical signs with which they decorated their rooms and which they wore in themselves, the colours of their attire, their jewellery that corresponded to one another ritual, the aromas and incense that was burned on their various altars, the formulation of oaths, and the prayers that the choir of participants would chant. We need to realise that these manuscripts, miraculously preserved, reveal to us a wondrous world in which the Moscow Neo-Rosicrucians resided. The universe was presented in front of them in the form of 7 cosmic circles, each including within itself diverse celestial systems, each of which had a personal name, and all of which were known to them, beginning from the quantity of inhabitable and uninhabitable worlds in their entirety, to the number of comets furrowing the expanses between the stars. In a corresponding manner, they viewed the history of the earth, humanity, and Russia as a field of battle between light and darkness, goodness and evil. They accepted the dualism of the ancient Manichaeans as the basis of the universe, and so figured that each Rosicrucian must traverse 2 consecrations, not just the light-filled, but the darkness-filled, also in order to be able to utilise the powers of darkness to his advantage. Those of you who've read the Mebes Tarot Majors course, or heard one of my talks on this, might recall that he also taught light and dark initiations, which is something I've puzzled over. I find it a grey area. I'm not wholly comfortable with that. Because I just think it's too open to abuse. I can imagine wanting to teach neophytes what the enemy might do to you. You have to, you have to be able to protect yourself. I think that is, in that respect, you could say it's justifiable. But harnessing the powers of darkness to his advantage, okay, like I say, we're straying into somewhat grey areas there, but nevertheless, this is what they did. Polisadov testified in 1933 that there exists this current of light and a current of darkness, which forms the necessity of having both a white and a black consecration. The white consecration, based on the current of light, promotes the evolutionary ascent into the spheres of the revelation of cognizance and the achievement of perfection. The black consecration, based on the current of darkness, entices matter into its spheres and darkens cognizance, interfering with evolution. From the beginning of time and forever the interminable struggle of the bright and dark forces occur on the astral plane, and so success is achieved on an alternating basis back and forth. It's very dualistic idea. The present moment of our passing life appears as the moment of the dominion of the dark powers, that is, the powers compelling a stop along the route of evolution as a result of the enslavement of cognizance of matter. Deliverance from the shackles of matter is accomplished with cognizance of the illusion of the physical plane, and so directing cognizance to the world of concepts. The concepts of Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, or the deity of goodness and the deity of evil, can be closely approximated and applied as the warring principles. As is well known, this concept is reflected in Christianity in the form of the future arrival of the Antichrist, son of Satan, who will dominate the world. The new Neo-Rosicrucians usually allocate much space to the philosophic understanding of goodness and badness, as he says, viewing the former as liberation from the shackles of matter, while the latter as being enveloped by matter. In the official teaching of the Orionist order, goodness and badness is handled only from a metaphysical point of view. In practical mysticism, that is, directing us to the root of the struggle against badness, more concrete information is provided regarding those who maintain badness in the astral plane and our ability to struggle against them. Well, yeah, I mean, this happens. Those of you, us, who've been attacked in the astral plane, might be quite glad to be taught how to combat that. Others might argue that if you're entering the astral plane in the proper way and with permission, you won't be vulnerable. Because access to the higher astral would be with a hierarchical guide. So you would be protected anyway. And then there are those people who just, astrally project. They're not even trying to. It just happens to them. And they might also wish to have some form of defence in case they become vulnerable in that state. The Orionists aspired from the beginning, as did the historical Rosicrucians, to acquire authority over the elemental powers of the earth and cosmos, and then authority over worldwide powers of evil, in order to become sovereigns of the world and benefactors of humanity. But authority and self-reliance always seem to be the most reliable and most effective traps for people who have the opinion they are the elect vessels. Sidorov possessed the largest and most complete personal library of books and collection of manuscripts in Moscow dealing with occultism, theosophy, the Templars, Rosicrucians and Masons. Somehow he was able to avoid prosecution at this time and until the end of his life, as though ignored by the GPU. He continued his interest in mysticism and had the conversations with his acquaintances on these topics and offered them his books to read regarding questions on occultism and theosophy. Here, for example, is a detailed description of the sequence for the collective performance of the Orionist rite, the great mystery of the elements, which was included in the manuscripts discovered. First was the general blessing of those present, and apparently provided by Belustin. Then the great oath of the great Telemos, a prophet of Greek mythology. Then they collectively recited the sacred hymn titled The Pentagram of the Great Elements. So, here we go. O great Telemus, the spirit matter of the revealed universe, your elements encompass the inaccessible abysses of the universe and also reside in me, because the universe and I are one. O great fire, the principle of life, you burn in each atom of existence and consciousness of the existent ones, and flare in me with the unquenchable spark of life. O great atmosphere, the principle of creativity, you enclose the worlds in a circle of light concepts and preserve them with hidden secrecy. O great waters, the principle of regeneration, you penetrate the entrails of things and flow through me as a lilac stream. O great earth, the principle of death and rebirth, you swallow the mother in order to open the gates of freedom to the spirit. We bless and praise you, the indescribable pentagram of the elements residing in the great pentagram of the human, and motivating its rays toward your primordial creativity in God, the human, and the world. All of this occurred naturally in a sacred language created by the Orionists, but translated into Russian for codification. Following the prayer was the great summons of the sovereign of the pentagram of elements. The room became silent and dark. Those present got on their knees and immersed themselves into mental contemplation of this silver disc. The participants would affix their attention and meditate. The silence was interrupted with lighting, and those present stood, walked up to the throne, and linked together this mystical chain. The sacred objects of the ritual were lifted: a cross, iron rod, sword, bowl, pentacle, and magic mirrors that were square and of a dark smoky colour. The great oath of the sovereign pentagram of the great elements was recited. Those present would then separate the links of the magical chain and bow to the supreme priest, apparently Belustin. They would return to their seats. Silence, and then a second immersion into darkness. Those present would ascend into ecstasy and again get on their knees. They would meditate. The silence was broken with lighting. The supreme priest would bless those attending with the sacred objects of the ritual. Those attending would rise, and beginning from the youngest and ending with the oldest, they would again bow to the supreme priest and return to their places. Then they would perform the sacred prayer, the presence of the pentagram of the great elements. Then those attending, beginning from the oldest and ending with the youngest, would approach the throne and take the sword in their right outstretched hand. They would get on their knees, then stand, and along with the supreme priest, take their turn walking around him and the smaller thrones. After bowing to the supreme priest, they would again return to their places. This symbolises the mystic rite of the marriage of the attending adherents with the elements. The rite would continue with a similar routine with other sacred objects and then ends. So now we've got that's 20. Right, I'll carry on for a little bit because we have a mysterious lady popping up here. Anna Rudolfovna Mintzlova. Some information needs to here be provided about Anna Rudolfovna Mintzlova. She seemed to have appeared from nowhere and disappeared likewise in the same manner. She was involved with several individuals mentioned as part of these other groups and was influential in her personal approach of a Rosicrucian order in Russia. She was born in Ryazan province, Russia, June the 10th, 1866. Minslova spoke most of the European language fluently and also had a mastery of Sanskrit, Latin and Greek. And so she became a translator of Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophical writings from German into Russian. While in Russia during her visits, she was the prime promoter of the Theosophist and Rosicrucian movements. From a young age, she displayed an interest in occult and esoteric themes and dedicated herself to their study. She was also known as a medium and performed chiromancy and graphology on her clients. Her spare time was spent in libraries where she became fluent in the ancient religions. There is no evidence that she ever married or even had a romance or any immorality. Much of what Minslova learned was from her close association with Annie Besant, the president of the Theosophical Society, and beginning in 1905, she was one of the first Russian pupils of Rudolf Steiner, the head of the German branch of the Theosophical Society at the time. Minslova considered herself Steiner's emissary in Russia, as well as having her personal agenda of introducing the Rosicrucian order into Russia and acquiring members. The first of Steiner's books to be translated into the Russian language by Minslova and published was in 1910, and it was Theosophy, an introduction to the suprasensible knowledge of the world and the destination of man. Minslova likewise attended international Theosophist congresses in London in 1905, Paris 1903 and 1906, and Munich in 1907, and likewise travelled to Norway. Minslova met with Valery Brusov in 1900 and continued correspondence with him from this time on. She became acquainted with M.V. Sabashnikova and Maximilian Voloshin in 1903 while in Paris at a Theosophist Congress, and introduced them to Theosophy, and where she was able to introduce Theosophy to Vyacheslav Ivanov in November 1906. Voloshin was the first of the Russian symbolists to fall under her intellectual and mesmerising influence. Shortly after, Minslova and Voloshin made a sacred pilgrimage to the Rouen Cathedral in Normandy, France. It was through Voloshin that Minslova was able to access and attend gatherings at the Religious Philosophical Society, and she met Andrei Bely, the writer there, in Moscow in late 1908. It was due to Mintslova's influence that Bely abandoned Helena Blavatsky's Theosophy in favour of Steiner's Anthroposophy. Later, Bely suspected Minslova to be psychologically ill and described her thus. She had a large face. She was obese, kind of like the cosmic expanse, toroidal, having an immense scale in every direction, although much of it void. In her black loose overall, she forced herself at me for a moment. It seemed that her large body was inflating, pressing, overflowing, and reaching to nowhere. But actually she would not be considered ugly. I remember the door was wide open and she flowed in, tumbled in her black sack. The overall she was wearing seemed to be a sack. The heavy horse head pushed itself between us, and her yellow braids stood up over her. And no matter how hard she tried to comb them, they stuck out like a bunch of snakes in clumps over her huge forehead, and she had no eyelashes. And she would squint with her little, near-sighted and dirty blue eyes. But her irises were like two wheels, not eyes at all, and they turned dark. It seems that they were bottomless, and her eyes, they would shred you apart. Regardless of such an uncomplimentary description by Belly, Minslova had the capacity to entice people towards her. She displayed herself as the announcer of the world beyond our frontiers, and just like Helena Blavatsky, she had contact with mysterious noospheric messengers called teachers, members of the secret brotherhood in the Himalayan mountains. And with much success, she was able to convince people that she was here to fulfill their will. Supposedly, they assigned Minslova the task and blessed her with the responsibility of building in Russia the kingdom of the spirit. One of the first sacrifices of Mintslova's mesmerising charms at the time was Maximilian Voloshin, as mentioned above. He later was likewise not sympathetic in his opinion of Minslova. He recorded the following about her in a letter. In the Middle Ages, she would of course have been burned as a witch in a bonfire. She is almost blind and recognises people based on the aura around their head. She is almost always dying from some type of coronary illness. Her income is from her translations of Oscar Wilde from English. Not one person that once is drawn to her remains the same as he was before. In another letter, Voloshin plainly called her a female vampire. It was during the years 1909 and 1910 that Belly and Ivanov fell into the clutches of this woman. Vyacheslav Ivanov was the worst because his wife, Lydia Dmitrievna Zinoviev Hannibal, sorry about my pronunciation, died recently, in 1907. Earlier, she and her husband hosted a literary salon that had the nickname The Tower, and where many of the symbolist adherents would gather. Now a widower, the unmarried Minslova found it easier to manipulate Ivanov, and they were about the same age, but the relationship was always on a platonic basis. Nonetheless, Minslova attended the Tower gatherings and utilised it to further herself as a channeler of the great teachers. Minslova practically made Ivanov's apartment her home when in St. Petersburg, and so had access to the symbolist adherents patronising it. In Moscow, she was close to the symbolist group, and Brusov published her translations of Steiner's compositions in scales, and Sergei Sokolov published them in grief. At the end of January 1910, during one of his regular trips to Petersburg to deliver lectures, Belly again came in contact with Anna Mintzlova, who was living at the Tower, the home of Ivanov. She intended to create a mysterial triumvirate, Belly, Ivanov and herself, Mintzlova. But the first of the three potential candidates had a sceptical attitude toward her right from the start, and the second was not far behind him. Mintzlova did everything she could to keep the two of them under her influence, knowing how valuable they were for her in the dissemination of anthroposophy and instituting her new Rosicrucian order in Russia. Belly admitted the following, recording it in his memoir. I was brought to life in her atmosphere, and she sanctified me in her nonsense. Here are a few words of her manipulation. We are standing at the threshold of an unprecedented revolution of consciousness. Personages are already appearing, regulating moral regeneration, but devious occultists are not slumbering. She likewise approved of my bad opinion of the Masons, and I was supposed to arm myself with their esoteric knowledge. Belly nonetheless did not completely ascertain what it was that Mintzlova herself saw, but he did acknowledge that she was right in some areas, in her perspectives and visions, and that beyond all doubt there was something there. He did recognise her as a genuine occultist, and wrote of this also to Bloch. The Rosicrucian route begins at that frontier of the soul beyond which begins either the deformation of health or the confirmation of spirit. The occultist method of development is the wise knowledge of the ability to confirm the region of human health. Mintzlova wrote the following in one of her letters to Belly. The great war is presently being waged, a decisive war in the sphere of nowhere else but in this world that is especially so close to you, Andrei Belly. in the celestial world, in the astral light. Yes, the Rubicon is in front of you, but the dice are already cast. You are already crossing the Rubicon. You are already at the world's border. I still do not know how all of this will occur, but I know that God is with you, and the light will be with you. Belly recorded the events in his memoirs. The Rosicrucian subject has its continuation in the circle of the former Argonauts. Minslova found eager listeners in the persons of Belly and Metna, and decided to unite the symbolist circle into some kind of secret society. She influenced the former Argonauts, Petrovsky, myself, Ellis, S.M. Solovyov, E.K. Metzner, Nilenda, N.M. Kiselov, M. Sizov, and Rachinsky. This was to form a new fraternity, having the appellation Order of the Knights of Truth. Minslova called her form of Rosicrucianism as Western European. Belly recorded his comprehension of her presentation in his memoirs. The Rosicrucians are divided into two directions: the Eastern fraternity, an esoteric branch of the movement where the older generations are fully developed, such as Kunrath, von Helmont, and others. This vein, as they said, went underground, and this became the Eastern fraternity, which consecrated Novikov. He was a Russian writer who lived 1744 to 1818 and who introduced Rosicrucianism to Russia. Events of the future summons the appearance of a new vein of Rosicrucianism, as long as it is consecrated by the powers of the old Rosicrucianism. Now a new order of knights appears. This organisation needs to be formed in Russia, and two persons must be found, one in Moscow and one in St. Petersburg, in order to gather all those who are tied with the fraternity and to create a type of spiritual world out of those persons who prepare themselves through spiritual exercises. The exercise is the weapon of the future. There is an exercise of the helmet of salvation maybe. Another is the life of the heart. Along is the life of the shield. And there is the exercise of the sword and the shoulder defence. It does sound like the armour of God. I've been summoned to help. I need to be immaculate, and this will genuinely motivate the concentration of people. There is already such a person in St. Petersburg. Together with Minslova, the three of us will compose the present triangle for the construction of the Temple of Knights. The circle will gather around these two. Minslova will create a tie with the Sacred Brotherhood. Her mission consists in transferring to us whatever is important from the ancient traditions. I mean, in my view, the one in Moscow was Shmakov, then Belustin, and the one in St. Petersburg was Mebes. I'm not sure if this is what they meant, but it's what I would say. It was then Minslova's intent to travel with Belly and Ivanov to a small Italian city, Assisi, where a Franciscan monastery is located. They would meet with other Rosicrucians, and there or in the vicinity they would be consecrated for the mission. But Belly by now divined a devious and fantastical character of this entire matter. He consulted with Emil Metzner on the issue in June 1910 and decided against the honour of travelling to Italy. Belly's decision did not gain him any favour with others who were mesmerised by Minslova, and they turned against him. For a long while, and after Minslova's disappearance, Belly still believed in his sacred selection and the need to travel to Assisi to execute it. But with Belly's later decision to leave Russia, the issue retreated into a latent form. Minslova took another occasion to create a Rosicrucian symbolist fraternity. But Ivanov, to detach himself from Minslova's grasp, left Russia in autumn 1910 for Europe on a vacation. Nothing more was done by Minslova. However, she continued to circulate in the various Theosophist circles. Shortly thereabouts, Minslova realised her failure in executing the task she was assigned by these teachers, and which she promised Steiner she would accomplish. About August 1910, Minslova wrote to Steiner, "Beloved dear, I received a second unconditional confirmation of that news of which I wrote to you in my previous letter. I must die. However, I must once more, for the third time, hear this summons, and then my hand will touch the omniscient, the blessed. I am now saturated with calm and joy. Not 1 minute of turbulence or agitation resides in me." After both Bely's and Ivanov's rejection of her propositions, Minslova realised her mission in Russia had failed and she had to somehow depart from the scene. She had no other choice. The dictate was issued, apparently, if this can be ascertained correctly from the letter, from these messengers called teachers. But she waited for a third confirmation and apparently received it. In a subsequent letter, her last to Ivanov, Minslova still promised him a consecration. Knowing of Ivanov's departure to Europe, she mentions to him of her intent to travel to Moscow from Petersburg, where she will get a passport, and then travel to Assisi, Italy, and meet him there. However, none of this materialised. Minslova attended a meeting of symbolists in Petersburg in late August and left without an indication of her next stop. She was seen momentarily in Moscow, as she intended in her letter, and then she was never to be seen again, and there is no indication of whatever occurred to her. She just disappeared. Her final sighting in Moscow occurred early September 1910. Minslova was 44 years of age. Berdyaev, who knew Minslova rather well, recorded the following in his memoirs. She then walked into the street, and no one, and not ever, saw her again. This is a photo of Minslova and Ivanov, who does indeed look captured. Occultists in general viewed this post-mortem world as part of a single reality. From their perspective, all death in any form is viewed as a natural step from the world of corporeal reality to another that is parallel but intangible. This action is as simple and painless as moving from one room to another. The conjecture is that Minslova, realising that her mission here did not succeed, could fearlessly depart from this life and migrate to the other. Not long before her disappearance, she disclosed to someone that the depths of the ocean awaited her. Bely summed up his complex and confused attitude towards Minslova in the following manner. Dear reader, I cannot explain anything concrete regarding these facts. It is all the same. It is so difficult to believe them, and they are not understandable to me either. I would just say a couple of words about it, what she relayed to me. I will state it abstractly, in general what she communicated. That she did not fulfil what was entrusted to her, and this was to fire hearts toward the light, unite us for the spiritual world. Her mission collapsed because her instability and illness, along with the growing atmosphere among us of distrust in her, loosened or undermined the entire bright activity of those certain unknown benefactors of humanity who were standing behind her. Meanwhile, she gave her word to them that a brotherhood of the spirit would be created among us. The lack of fulfilment of her words fell on her very heavily. Now they are exiling her forever and away from people and associations that extended around her. She disappears from that time forever, and no one will ever see her again. She beseeched us all, those who were close to her these years, to keep strict silence about the reasons for her terminating banishment. I did not understand at the time what her banishment specifically signified. Banishment where? To a monastery? To prison? To another country? Or did she mean to vanish from life? But she did make a hint that this time her supposed nonsense was not at all a myth, and that we will never see her. I guess this can happen. Literal opinions are released as paper snakes. Their tails twitch while on their backside lying under the sky. And now I take consideration of her words as to something that is terrifying. Her secret, of which nothing is known to me, perplexes my entire soul. One thing is known. She was right. Rumours circulated that Minslova did manage to reach Assisi, Italy, and the Rosicrucian monastery, and lived there incognito for the balance of her life. But no evidence indicates she went anywhere after her final sighting in Moscow. Supposedly Minslova sent a note to Belli in Moscow that she had arrived, but no copy of this note exists. Other speculators are that she was institutionalised under a pseudonym or had a sudden and unexpected death with no identification, or suicide. Of all the options, death as a result of some type of heart failure is the most veritable, as she earlier indicated having coronary disease, and then a burial as some anonymous or unidentifiable person. Mintslova's fate was just as enigmatic as her mission. Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose she was right, like I say, in terms of there being a Mebs in St. Petersburg and a Shmakov and then a Belustin in Moscow. And of course, people with this type of prophetic or clairvoyant ability are often way ahead of the game. Very frustrating for them because they're aware of what should be coming, but they're not able to bring it to fruition in their time. And by the time it does happen, their foresight can tend to be forgotten. That's just the way it is. So that was... And then the next chapters are going to be on Shmakov and the law of synergy. So this is a highly interesting and recommended book. New Rosicrucians of Early Soviet Russia by Daniel Shubin. Fascinating accounts of the occultism of that time. And hopefully that's given a little bit more context about the Russian Rosicrucians and Templars of the early 20th century.